I first encountered Miles on the Commission for Unalienable Rights. He gave this presentation to us, and it was this fantastic presentation. I said to myself then, immediately, I said, oh, we have to invite him to give a talk for Telos. And so, voila, he's here. I'm really very just delighted that he's able to do this for us. He is a professor of Chinese military and diplomatic history at the U.S. Naval Academy. He's also a fellow at the Hudson Institute, also at the Project 2049 Institute, and also with the Hoover Institution. He has a book that he wrote on OSS China, and he also wrote a book, The Dragon's War, on the Allies and China from 1937 to 1947. So he comes to us with a wealth of experience about this issue. He's also recently worked very closely with Mike Pompeo at the U.S. State Department in the Policy and Planning Office. And he continues to work closely with him, developing ideas on how the U.S. can engage with China. So please welcome Miles Yu. Really looking forward to his remarks.
Thank you very much, and so it's a great honor for me to be here, and I don't know how to even say that name, Telos or Telos. So this is I know it's sounds very profound. It is very profound. I've been reading some materials. Somebody just told me a few minutes ago its etymology actually comes from the word teleology. So I say teleology, so I'm going to say Telos now. I came from a military institution where there's no clash of ideas. So so I think I'm in the business of education. They think I'm in the business of instruction. So I might say something, they will agree with me. So if I, out of my professional bad habit, I say something offensive, all I'm asking is don't come here to smack me in my face like what happened in Hollywood the other night. David, thank you very much for the very kind invitation and generous introduction. And as David indicated, I, for the last several years, been working for another fine Italian American, Mike Pompeo, who's our Secretary of 70th Secretary of State. He and I used to joke about he's very, it's the Army Navy thing, so it's always getting a little bit tense sometimes. And so he used to joke about he's being Italian, tougher, good, and very good filmmakers, and Ennio Morricone, Sergio Leone, all kind of stuff. So, at one point I told him, I said, I am actually Italian American too, because I have probably 1/2400th of Italian because of Marco Polo in there. So it's a great honor to be here anyway. Yeah. So now David asked me to give a talk, and I foolishly gave him a title: "Escape from Civilization's Predicaments." This is a predicament itself too, because it's too grandiose. So put me into this kind of a quandary, but it did give me some time to think about it. So I am not a philosopher, as I am told that many of you are, but I was trained as a historian, and by definition, a historian is almost like a failed philosopher. So, but I am a product of a deeply philosophical zeitgeist, emblematic of our generations. As some of you may have known, I was born in China. I was raised there, and I came to this country several decades ago. And China is a country for the last several decades that has been vandalized by a radical Western communist ideology, an ideology that was said to be deeply rooted in critical philosophies of modern times. I mentioned about the title of this talk. The talk, one of the problem is that it centers on my predicament is centered on the definition of the word civilization. Civilization is a very ambiguous term to me. It became fashionable when evolutionist thinking became dominant since the late 18th century. It connotes a notion of advanced cultural achievements as opposed to the lower stages of human evolution, or as the 19th century anthropologist Henry Morgan said, from savagery to barbarism and then to civilization. When this interpretive framework in the age of European expansion became very popular, the civilizing West often was said to encounter the predicament of interacting with the less civilized regions, and for a prolonged period, these encounters were held as a noble and often exhilarating mission, a glorious epic struggle of civilization over darkness and backwardness. Nowadays, however, the notion of civilization has gone through a revolutionary redefinition. On one hand, there is this belief that all cultural civilizations are of equal value, and we are in fact living in a multicultural world without a value hierarchy. In other words, the world is flat. On the other hand, the old divides of cultural and religious boundaries still exist, and the contemporary world's conflicts and problems are often explained in terms of the clash of civilizations, an irreconcilable, uncompromising cycle of opposition and hostility along cultural, religious, and ethnic lines. I found this approach of defining world affairs and mankind's predicaments in terms of civilization identification quite inadequate sometimes. As many of us know, the word civilization originates from this Latin word civilis, meaning belonging to a society. It is a cultural definition assuming people who share the same value, aesthetic taste, religious and intellectual heritage would form unique and separate civilizational blocks and belong together. Thus, we often hear scholars refer to terms such as the Islamic civilization, the Chinese civilization, the Christian civilization, or the Confucian civilization, and so on. But this approach to understanding our world, it seems to me, is epistemologically flawed. Within the same civilizational block, for example, there are large communities that really do not belong at all. A Confucian civilization cannot explain the drastic differences between mainland China and Taiwan. North and South Korea are in the same civilizational block, yet they are completely different nations with opposite cultural and political realities. The same thing could be said of the former East and West Germany. The civilization approach is not only inadequate and epistemologically flawed, it can also aggravate old wounds and augment conflicts. The ongoing Ukraine tragedy is partly a result of this dangerous notion of civilizational belonging. Ukraine, or at least the Russian-speaking region of Ukraine, is believed by Vladimir Putin as belonging to a Moscow-centered Slavic civilization. This pronouncement of Russia's theoretical justification for aggression is appalling to many who share a cultural heritage with a powerful nation nearby, but nevertheless have developed their own political and national identity. 3 weeks ago, I was with Secretary Mike Pompeo in a visit to Singapore. It was at the height of Russia's war on Ukraine. If you ever work at the State Department or any other international organization, you will know that Singapore has been a master of getting along with all sides of international confrontation and never easily offending anyone. But not this time. Singapore government reacted uncharacteristically aggressively with unmistakable clarity. It was one of the first countries to impose sanctions on Russia. Deep inside Singapore's bold move is a profound fear of the Putin logic of civilizational belonging to be applied by China in Asia Pacific. More than any other countries in Southeast Asia, about 80% of Singaporeans are ethnic Chinese. Singapore's strong reaction to an event far away is therefore not only a manifestation of moral repulsion, but more of a practical strategic move against China a similar aggressor in Singapore's own backyard, a country with an insatiable appetite for treating all Chinese-speaking people worldwide as belonging to a Chinese civilization led by the Chinese Communist Party. Before we visit Singapore, we had spent 4 days in Taiwan. About 95 to 97% of Taiwanese are ethnic Chinese. As you can imagine, the reaction to Russia's Ukraine gambit caused a seismic shock in the island democracy, for the same reason Singapore had. Taiwan's reaction against Russia was extraordinarily tough, swift, and much stronger. The reason is that if Russia could invade Ukraine on account of protecting ethnic Russians in another country, China could do the same with the pretext of protecting ethnic Chinese or Chinese-speaking regions near and far. So why am I saying all this? Well, what I'm aiming for is to suggest a different way of understanding our world's predicaments. Instead of using civilization as a yardstick and a category or a criteria, we probably use something different. So I suggest we use the concept of ideology. First of all, let me clarify what I mean by ideology, because ideology in Washington is a very loaded word. It harks back to some of the recent memory of confrontation and hostility. As you know, the word ideology came out of the French Revolution. Originally, it denotes a system of ideas that form the dominant principles under which a government and a society function. In Chinese, the word ideology, or 意识形态, literally means mode of consciousness, which is often coupled with the word superstructure, or 上层建筑. But in our modern usage, ideology has been most closely related to a totalitarian system of thoughts, particularly communism. Initially, the mid-19th century Marxists and communists used it to mean the political and the philosophical underpinnings of the means of production and the material foundation of a society. Today, this broad Marxist definition of ideology still applies, mostly in a philosophical sense. But in contemporary communist world, especially in China, ideology as a political system of ideas simply means the domains of political awareness that conforms to the thoughts of Marx, Lenin, Mao, and other correct communist leaders. Of course, not every part of the world outside of America and Europe is communist. For these non-communist regions, ideology can mean also the conceptual and intellectual sources of human behaviors and the government actions and policies. It deals with the fundamental non-material forces that animate and motivate a nation, a religious community, a government, or an ethnic group. The fact that we have not used ideology to understand the modern world, especially to understand the communist world, is surprising to me. My childhood and early adolescence were permeated with daily readings of the fundamentals of Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin, and Mao, all of whom fancied themselves as profound political philosophers of their times, deeply involved in their proletarian heroic epic struggle against their reactionary bourgeois philosophy counterparts, such as Kant and Hegel. While many children here in the United States were consumed by the ethos and useful ennui of Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, and the heroes of Horatio Alger and Nancy Drew, I was reading the German ideology, the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, the conditions of the working class in England, the state and revolution, the Communist Manifesto, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, the quotations of Chairman Mao, and my favorite is Mao Zedong's on Khrushchev's phony communism and its historical lessons for the world. Like most Chinese immigrants of my generation, after I came to the United States more than 35 years ago, I also went through a prolonged and very painful intellectual deprogramming of my early indoctrination imposed upon me by my upbringing in a communist country. But truth be told, even before my new burst of freedom in this country, my normal youthful rebelliousness had already cast doubt in my mind about the philosophical foundation of Marxist ideology. Its internal inconsistency, its abject failure in predicting the trends of capitalism, its dogmatism, historical determinism, its empirical and epistemological inadequacies, and so on. Even though I consider myself completely cured of my former infection with the communist ideology, having also acquired strong immunity to it, and I have dedicated much of my life to dealing with the ideological world I left behind. That is to say, I'm acutely aware of the power behind a tortured world, fundamentally motivated and inspired by ideological powers and dogmatic devotions. By so doing, however, I have found that I put myself in an intellectual predicament of my own making. Truth is that I do not have many like-minded friends in this pursuit. I realize that America suffers from a severe case of poverty of ideology. Most people don't look at the world in terms of ideology, and we overwhelmingly base these worldly judgments on actions and deeds, but seldom on the ideological sources of these actions and deeds. It is the Amnesty International approach, which focuses on bad deeds, but not necessarily on why those bad deeds occur. I cannot explain exactly the reason for this peculiar phenomenon. One possible reason is that most Americans believe in the universality of human goodness, because the country was founded on the noble creed that all men are created equal. By extension, if everyone is given a fair chance, all people will naturally behave the same. If Americans think communist ideology and theories sound odd and unnatural, they tend to think these ideological theories must also be odd to all other people as well. Moreover, the Cold War with the Soviet Union created a psychological resistance in American intelligentsia, as many Americans were genuinely scared of the war with the nuclear power. Political excesses such as McCarthyism created a backlash too among many ideologically untrained Americans. That's why, in my opinion, McCarthyism is one of the single biggest events that gave anti-communism in America a bad name. People who know the truth about communist ideology are afraid of pointing out the symbiosis between the radical ideology and the communist government's conduct, for fear of being accused of being an anti-communist McCarthyite. This poverty of ideology in the West has proved self-defeating when we deal with an ideologically charged outside world. It has led to abject failures in our foreign policy. Particularly devastating is to our China policy, as our national leaders and the leading intellectuals have not been able to adequately understand the fundamental symbiosis between communist ideologies and Chinese government policies and practices. George Kennan got this right about the similar symbiosis in the Soviet Union in 1946 and 47, but few have gotten this right on China. Western poverty of ideology also hampers our ability to effectively implement good policies as well. We all know the Trump administration correctly and courageously designated the Chinese Communist Party's atrocities in Xinjiang's Uyghur region a genocide. We went out our way to rally the world's support for our condemnations and sanctions against China's genocide in Xinjiang. Yet, we failed to get any Muslim majority nations to take an open stand with us in our collective pushback against Beijing's repression of their Muslim brothers and sisters. The reason is quite simple, because the US government's approach to Xinjiang was overwhelmingly focused on the deeds of the Chinese atrocities, but not the communist ideology behind the genocide. China's ultimate goal is to eradicate the Uyghurs' Islamic beliefs and ethnic identity. The Leninist state in Beijing locks the Uyghurs up by the millions in a massive concentration camp system, not just to physically torment them, but more importantly, to brainwash them and reform their thoughts into Marxism, Leninism, and the other communist theories. When we condemn China's deeds of repression, few Muslim majority countries care to join because some of them carry out physical repression of their own. But if we focus our effort on China's assault on Islamic religion in the region, in the Uyghur region, it will be much more effective, and it will be much harder for the ruling elites of many Muslim countries to ignore America's call for condemnation and sanctions against the Beijing's genocidal regime. Let me now spend a few minutes laying out how imperative it is for us to understand the singular importance of communist ideology in China's government functions. While most countries have a few fundamental principles, for the United States, for example, they include popular sovereignty, limited government, separation of powers, checks and balances, and federalism. Today's China still adheres to the official PRC fundamental principle laid out by Mao Zedong in 1954 that simply says, the force at the core that leads our cause is the Chinese Communist Party. The theoretical foundation that guides our thinking is Marxism-Leninism, unquote. In the 20th century, Marxist theories have gained even more prominence in China. Enabled by revolutionary information technologies, the Chinese Communist Party is saturating China's public and private spaces with intense and ceaseless nationwide indoctrination campaigns, extolling Marxism, Leninism, and the thoughts of major Chinese communist leaders. It would be wrong for me to fail to point out that while the general national ethos is to ignore the ideology factor as a preferred approach to foreign policies, Marxism and its many intellectual variations have been quite popular among American intelligentsia and American campuses. This was actually quite astonishing to me when I first came to this country many decades ago. The first seminar I ever took in American college at the elite East Coast Liberal Arts College outside of Philadelphia was about dominant ideology, which was basically a reading seminar on anything written by the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci, who is in the news quite recently because of the theoretical framework Gramsci provided to the controversial critical race theory. In my graduate school, a few years later, at a very prominent university in Northern California, that is not Stanford, I couldn't escape my encounter with Marxism and neo-Marxism either. My required readings include Eric Hobsbawm, Emma Goldman, Noam Chomsky, and of course, Derrida and Foucault. I think one of the reasons why Marxism is popular among American intellectuals is that Marxism is a philosophically all-encompassing with a universal application for any human conditions, especially about all forms of suffering and alienation. Or in Marxist parlance, it's called alienation from the true human nature. As you probably recall, that Marx has a very famous writing called the 1844 Manuscript on Philosophy and Economy, something like that I read when I was in college in China. It's in Chinese, and that's a very good translation, by the way. According to Marxism, what creates this alienation of true humanity is social classes, nations, communities, and individuals. This theory of alienation thus engenders a staunch request by Marxists worldwide to find the ultimate emancipation from human predicaments and a soothing pathway for mankind to arrive at a primal oneness in peace and harmony. In other words, what Marx prescribes is a powerful promise of a state of unity of the entire human species in equality and harmony. Not just Western intellectuals are gullible to this deceptively attractive ideology. The Chinese intelligentsia for the past 200 years also have embarked on a similar relentless Marxist philosophical search for an all-encompassing world order of supreme harmony, free of all a priori human alienation as well. What has ailed China, according to this thinking, is not just the abject defeats in the Opium Wars, the Sino-Japanese Wars, and all the humiliating unequal treaties, but something much deeper. It is a Chinese systemic failure China desperately needs a cosmic system to solve all its problems. It's therefore a 体系 problem. When this Chinese sense of self-enriching alienation reached its zenith around the time of the Versailles Conference in 1919, the Chinese intelligentsia was thrilled beyond description to find the all-encompassing Marxist philosophy, a soothing system of thoughts that promises emancipation from all sorts of individual and national humiliation. My Hoover institution colleague, the consistently insightful Thomas Sowell, says it brilliantly in his seminal 1985 work, Marxism, Philosophy, and Economics. And I quote, "The Marxian vision took the overwhelming complexity of the real world and made the parts fall into place in a way that was intellectually exhilarating and confer such a sense of moral superiority that opponents could be simply labeled and dismissed as moral lepers or blind reactionaries. Marxism was and maintains a mighty instrument for the acquisition and maintenance of political power," unquote. This obsession with finding a universal order of harmony has manifested itself in our generation. Even after the collapse of the Soviet Communist Empire, Marxism as a state ideology may be finished in much of the world, but it has inspired a unique pursuit for universal oneness and cosmic harmony. You can see this from our rush to declare an end of history, the ultimate liberation of the entire world from our alienating Cold War of division, confrontation, and proxy wars. Francis Fukuyama famously and infamously wrote in the national interest on the occasion of Berlin Wall's downfall in 1989, and I quote, "What we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government," unquote. Even more sensational is the greatest observational philosopher of our times, the eminent thought leader, Thomas Friedman of the New York Times, who in 2005 declared that the world is now flat. That is, a harmonious globalization had finally arrived. All insurmountable barriers separating all parts of the world are now demolished by the benign forces of globalizing mutual dependency and interconnecting telecommunication technologies. Shanghai and New York are basically operating on the same industrial and philosophical principles and the political ethos, because Mr. Friedman had found excellent bagels and boundless supply of Starbucks coffees in both cities. This line of thinking, wishing for a universal harmonious order despite of reality, could be dangerous too, because it essentially denies individuality and pluralism. Contrary to Marxist vision for a harmonious universe, or what the Chinese Communist Party General Secretary Xi Jinping has been advocating for, a Chinese Communist Party-led community of common destiny for mankind, or 人类命运共同体. Most people do not want to live in a world with such oneness and unitary unanimity. Different civilizations, be it Islamic, Confucian, or Christian, all want to keep their unique identity, sometimes even through violent means. Attempts to confiscate such differences have caused catastrophic consequences. Furthermore, it is even futile to achieve such cosmic oneness because the backlashes will be and have been powerful. In fact, facing alarming harmonization of national identities and the founding principles through the forces of globalization and technological revolutions, the world's leading countries have reacted with profound resistance. The momentous surge of Donald Trump in the 2016 election and the furious rise of Xi Jinping's Marxist-Leninist fundamentalism in China can both be interpreted as evidence of this wave of powerful pushbacks against such search for a globalized world order. The Trump phenomenon stressed America first, with a strong focus on America's 18th century founding. Similarly, General Secretary Xi Jinping could no longer risk the communist regime losing to globalizing forces of markets and free exchange of ideas. Therefore, he implemented the most rigid and fanatical Marxism-Leninism indoctrination, calling for every of the nearly 100 million Chinese Communist Party members to return to Marxist fundamentalism by a relentless national campaign called 勿忘初心, translated in English as never forget our original commitment to communism. As it has turned out, to the chagrin of Fukuyama and Friedman, history has not ended. All of the Enlightenment principles are being seriously challenged by authoritarian regimes in Moscow and in Beijing. The world is not flat, as economic, trade, information, political, military, and technological barriers are keeping free countries and captive nations further and further apart. Technologies have brought means to access unprecedented amount of information, but the information itself inside communist China, for example, is censored, filtered, and distorted by a high-tech Orwellian censorship and surveillance system. This is not caused by clash of civilizations, but by clash of ideologies. Ideologies of freedom and democracy versus ideologies of tyranny and dictatorship. Finally, excuse me, I would like to conclude my remarks by quoting Xi Jinping when he admonished his comrades in China in 2017 excuse me, at the 19th CCP Party Congress, and urged them to fully grasp the urgency of the epic struggle between the ideologically intoxicated Chinese Communist Party and the rest of the free world. Quote, "The wheels of history roll on. The tides of times are vast and mighty. History looks kindly on those with resolve, with drive and ambition, and with plenty of guts. It won't wait for the hesitant, the apathetic, and those shy of a challenge." End of quote. That's a call for action on behalf of Chinese communists in search of a Chinese Communist Party-led community of common destiny for mankind. Are we ready for the challenge? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. Why don't you just, can you just
Yours?
restate the
Okay,
program?
sure, absolutely. Yeah.
You can take questions.
David, thank you very much. Miles, and thank you very much.
Maybe before you speak, maybe just introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Mark Stallman. I'm the president of the Center for the Study of Digital Life, and I'll be speaking tomorrow afternoon at 2 p.m. in session number 4. With a presentation entitled Three Spheres, East, West, and Digital. I hope you have a chance to attend. Miles, you and I have a lot in common, as it turns out. We both had relationships with Andy Marshall at Office of Assessment, Pentagon.
Thank you. I happen to have been one of a handful of Westerners who attended the second conference on Marxism at PKU. I took that opportunity to do two things. One of them was to try to have conversations with the Western Marxists who had been invited to dress things up. But far more importantly, I had extensive conversations with deans of the School of Marxism spread across the country. There was no Marxist-Leninism. The Chinese were not talking Marxist-Leninism at all. The Americans and Europeans who were there were baffled. What happened to Marx? What happened to Lenin? So Marxism, as it has been crafted, based on my own experience, is quite different from what you have just described.
Yeah.
Could you explain that difference, please?
Yeah. Okay. First of all, Chinese Communist Party was founded in 1921 by the Comintern, by the Third Communist International. Ever since its founding in 1921, Chinese Communist Party has always been in a constant struggle against what the party insiders call the revisionism. So the Soviet Union is not genuine communism because of all kinds of revisionists, right? Stalin was a good one, but he's dead. And then Khrushchev onward, they're all not genuine. China has fought all sorts of other versions of communism, right? Tito in Yugoslavia, Castro in Cuba. And in the views of Chinese Communist Party, no other version of communism is truer to its original version of communism than the Chinese Communist Party. So we often hear the Chinese communists say, you know what, we're building socialism with Chinese characteristics. People always misunderstood. Somehow this is Chinese national characteristic. No. What Chinese Communist Party is saying is, this is a Chinese communist version with the Chinese Communist Party's interpretation of original communist theories. So that's why it's very important for them to if you read the Chinese now listen, when on the occasion of Karl Marx's 200th anniversary, the birthday, and Karl Marx's birthplace was Trier, Germany. Which country, which entity did all the celebratory stuff? China donated a huge, gigantic statue. They give money to that place. So that's what they're so Marxism, what the Chinese say is their version of communism is pretty authentic. There are about 3,000 colleges and universities in all of China. There are about 3 times as many party schools. I mean, party schools, we're not talking about Chico or other schools, right? We're talking about the Communist Party cadre training school. Its job is to train to study Marxism and Leninism. So they have their unique brand of communism. So I suspect the one you went to probably with Professor Michael Farquhar and several other people in Peking University when China took out. China wants to establish the sort of as a center of the global Marxist theory study. That's what Peking University is about. So they throw out a lot of money to do that. So I don't know how much they actually have discussed in an international forum, openly about what they believe is authentic Marxism and Leninism. But based on what I know, there's sort of a open and behind that view. Secondly, I would say there's this. You may be right. The Chinese do not talk much about Marxism nearly as much as about Leninism, right? So in Chinese party school, in Chinese orthodox interpretation of Marxism, this place a lot of emphasis on Leninism. Now, Lenin is different from Marxism in several ways. Number one, Lenin say, hey, listen, Marx said the most likely, the most possible, the most genuine communist revolution will first take place in the most industrialized countries, right? Like Great Britain and the United States. Marx was wrong. Lenin said, no. The imperialism is kind of a chain. It's global. Therefore, the opposition is most likely to break out, to break at the weakest link. So that's Lenin's theory. China is really much into the weakest link. That's why China, unlike the Soviet Union, always very keen to fomenting communist movement in the so-called third world, right? Because that's the weakest chain. So another thing is, unlike Marx, Lenin really stressed the ultimate importance of the role of the vanguard of the proletariat. That is the party. So Leninism is really important. In China, you go anywhere, I mean, party is supreme. Party rules every aspect of human existence, right? So that's why. So that's Leninism, and this is all theory. There's a lot of theories over there. So what I will suggest is, seriously, if you read the People's Daily, you read Xinhua, right? Just read them every day. I mean, party talk. Xi Jinping is not like an alien. He talks language that it's like Elon Musk. Elon Musk talks English that I don't understand, but it's revolutionary. He's an out-of-box thinker, right? Xi Jinping talks about different kind of out-of-box thinker. It's all full of jargons. I mean, this guy has a PhD in Marxism from Tsinghua University. I mean, that's what they are. I hope I understand the question.
microphone. Right behind you, Dory.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed very much your presentation. It has been very comprehensive. So there are many different topics, but maybe I would like to ask you, because you have been talking about the class of civilizations and then the class of ideologies. So I wanted to ask you whether you understand today's international context or a scenario, not just as a class of ideologies, but maybe as a class of power and domination. We have different ways of understanding the international society. So I think that we all believe in an international society that it's going to be built upon international organizations, cooperation. Maybe that's a little bit idealistic, no? And maybe what we're having now, it's civilizations, ideologies, but also power and domination, which perhaps put us back, you know, like we're in the 21st century, so we should be making some progress, and sometimes it feels like we're going backwards. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about your ideas. Thank you again. I really loved the presentation.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's right. So there's a reason why I want to frame my presentation as a philosophical discourse, not a discussion about geopolitics and power. One of the most amazing books I've ever read about Marxism, in addition to those classics, is by the Polish writer Kolakowski. Kolakowski, remember the first sentence of his book, he said, Karl Marx is a German philosopher. That, to me, is an astonishing statement. He's not a communist. He's not a socialist. He's not a social scientist. He's a philosopher, right? So that's why I want to basically try to get as much of the sort of philosophical underpinning of the actions and the thirst for power, right? Now, if you want to talk about power, yes, they're all related, but that's a different domain. That's for something like an Association for Political Science convention, right? To talk about that kind of stuff. But I'll just give you one example. For example, the Chinese Communist Party leader Xi Jinping, he has been known in the West as a guy who has conducted an incredible amount of purges. Right? I mean, he purged like thousands of people. The entire high command in the People's Liberation Army from his predecessor are purged. We're talking about like 5 stars, 4 stars, but hundreds. The reason he does this, you might say, from your perspective, I'm sorry if I haven't misunderstood your question. Yes, this is for personal power grabbing, because he wants to consolidate his power. But see, that's a misunderstanding of the motive. Xi Jinping is deeply sort of infected with this kind of theory. He really is guided by a lot of theories. So in his understanding of these things, in Marxism, there is this thing called the dialectical process, right? So you had this, thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis, right, over there. So the party Xi Jinping believed, because the Communist Party has so many people, and there are people who are young, who are old, people who are correct, people who are wrong, and how do you actually make sure that the essence of the party remain true? You have to go through a dialectical process, constantly get rid of the one that's not good. That mechanism, in Xi Jinping's thought, is purging. So it's not necessary for power. Of course, it's very convenient, but he can interpret this with the Marxist theory, which is deeply philosophical and deeply intellectual, and deadly intellectual, I should say. So he actually, this is not Xi Jinping's own invention, by the way. If you look at the history of the Communist parties, they're full of purges. I mean, this is different from, this is different from the kind of feudal communism. That's a phrase I just invented. Right? Like in Cuba or in North Korea, where the father died, the son took over, and the brother died, the older brother died, the younger brother took over. So that's different. That's a little bit feudal. In a more authentic and Leninistic state like China, I mean, they really follow the ideas. They follow the philosophical understanding of what power, what structure, and superstructure is all about. So that basically, that's my sort of a detour answer to your question.
I think that maybe sometimes I might be focusing on just one element, and maybe it's to understand certain situations or contexts. It's good to take different perspectives. So the philosophical, the political, the realpolitik. So thank you so much.
Yeah. So I've read a lot of things about the genocide, the atrocity, killings, because historians it's a very grim business. So Pol Pot was not a monster. If you know Ho Chi Minh, he's not bad guy's human being. But those people designed their society that have enormous consequence based upon some very simple theories. Those were ideologically intoxicated people doing incredible things. Conversely, I don't want to sound like a little bit too dialectical, but you look at Robespierre, right? That guy is also, they created a dictatorship of virtues. So ideas matter. So individual power, yes, of course matters. Sometimes the mingle. Vladimir Putin, he did some terrible things, but he has some theories, some ideas, and that's why I'm trying to understand very hard. Okay, and that's why Putin was not a monster in the eyes of this powerful ideology. He's 85% popular approval rating in Russia right now. That means he actually was able to tap into some kind of national psyche that's much deeper than his personal ambition for power.
Could you just introduce yourself? I didn't get your name. No, but I am asking you to introduce yourself.
I think he's asking you to introduce yourself.
No.
Your name?
Oh, I'm Leah. Sorry. I'm sorry.
Hi, my name's Casey Spinks. I'll be presenting a paper tomorrow morning. Thank you for your talk. I was struck by one point where you compared developments in 2016 with both Xi Jinping and Donald Trump's. And I was struck by the fact in which you mentioned that both of them were straining to bring back these values and ideologies from the past.
Yeah.
And of course, I fully agree with you. Ideas are very important here, but I'm also struck by the fact that these are reproductions of ideas, not perhaps the production of new ideologies and things that are kind of pushing us into the future, but rather either straining to go back or try. And I would say even some of the responses to Trump's rise exhibit some of those characteristics as well, like our democratic values are at stake if we don't beat Trump's, things like. So there's a lot of reaching back towards the past. So what do you think is going on there with these ideas? Because as important as ideology and ideas are, it seems like Fukuyama is right, at least in one sense, in that we aren't seeming to be producing new ones.
Okay, so I don't think we're living in the age of nuances now. That's itself, I think, can explain the rise of Donald Trump as well, because we live in the age of information where we have so much information we don't know what to make of it, sense of it. I think Donald Trump's genius is that he could articulate some very simple things using a very straightforward language that the commoners could understand. And he tapped into the national psyche when he could relate globalization as a force to extinguish unique American tradition. And that's pretty powerful, right? You tap into the Tea Party. It's not Donald Trump, Tea Party had before him. So I think he could make the voice heard and echoed. And so I think that's you're absolutely right. It's not a new idea, but I was not saying it's new. What I say is he tapped into the national psyche, and people have this anxiety. So when I was reading all those angry articles, from all the publications, now reminds me of this kind of a profound perplexity several generations ago, when I was in graduate school, one of the books I read which struck me most was The Education of Henry Adams. It's an amazing book, because that also was United States by that time, by the late, the end of the century, right, turn of the century, it went through this profound change of ethics, of ethos, and revolutionaries were no longer needed. The heroes of the society were no longer moralistic virtues and John Adams and James Madison. It's robber barons. It's people who have money, right? So those people go through all kinds of changes. And he was also profoundly perturbed by the rise of a different kind of a world order. Might makes it right. So the loss of like a moral argument, moral persuasion. And I think, Americans were profoundly troubled by those things, by globalizing forces and globalizing technologies. I think Trump was like that. But I don't want to get into trouble so that some of you can come back and smack me in my face because of we're talking about Donald Trump in New York City. This is like, I'm trying to refrain from use another phrase that Joseph Conrad is famous for. Yeah.
My name is Fernando Gomez Herrero. I'll be talking tomorrow in the afternoon. It's a clarification question. You have claimed a philosophical discourse separate from geopolitics. So my question is, what do you call your philosophical discourse? Because obviously you have you have shown a visceral anti-communism, anti-Chinese regime, okay? So whether we find that convincing or not is another matter.
Yeah,
whether we're sympathetic with you is another matter. But I'm wondering your self-description, your self-definition as to how you understand the term philosophy in your own explanation of things.
Okay, so I think you're right. You use the word claim. I did claim that I tried to separate. How successful my attempt was, that's a different matter. So I don't think I have a visceral sort of emotional response to the regime. I mean, I've led that country almost 40 years now. So time, as a famous geostrategist in Washington said the other day, the passage of time does bring significance in reality. So what I have benefited from the passage of time is actually this kind of psychological distance between me and that. And so what I'm trying to bring to you today is what I think, as best as I could, is the reality of China. China is a country saturated with the communist ideological indoctrination. All Chinese policies, domestic and foreign, are guided by those fundamental principles. And if you ask me if I have shown any kind of a emotional response to the lack of attention to that, yes, I do. I live in the United States. I live in Washington, D.C. I was deeply involved in policy formulation. And it was absolutely appalling to me to see many of our China experts spend their lifetime doing United States government. They totally ignore this idea of China as a communist country is new to them. So everything that we do in Washington, D.C. for decades is a matter of foreign policy. Our job is to manage a relationship. It's not to consider how our subject country is totally different. They operate on a completely different principle. And we have to have that kind of sense of realism in order to formulate our own policy. The dilemma here is that because two systems are completely incompatible, therefore, you really cannot do total reciprocity. When China shut down the American journalist offices in Beijing, we cannot kick all of journalists out of this country because it's a matter of different kind of countries, right? And there's a law. So that's the problem. But somehow we have to open society is a great thing. It's a strength of democracy, but open society is also vulnerable. That's why, and many of my colleagues in the State Department, we actually try to figure out what's the best way for the Americans to combat this, I would say, massive infiltration. Sounds very conspiratorial, not for impact by the Chinese government. I mean, their impact is pretty strong here, and that affected the fundamental sinews of what America is all about. So that's what I'm saying. So I want to alert people. There is this reality out there that's different. China is a very different country. Russia is also a different country. We have to have a sense of reality.
Well, we had a question here.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Alex Hu. I'm in undergraduate junior at Yale University. It's my first time at a Telos event, so thank you. I have a question about the ongoing Confucian revival in China right now, or rather the general sort of religious revival, right? I mean, the Confucian case specifically, you have the Communist Party sort of astroturfing the church movement and all of this. It seems like the sort of spiritual reawakening of Chinese society has been sort of going on a fairly consistent trajectory since the 80s, right? More and more people getting involved. And so do you see this, because we're speaking about civilizations today, as potentially going to transform the regime itself? Because it seems like there is a kind of outpouring of feeling.
That's a very good question. Now, implied in your question is basically, this idea that when I say communists in China, I'm not talking about the ordinary people. Overwhelming majority of Chinese people don't really believe in communism at all. However, China is a dictatorship. What really matters is the power elite, the ruling class, the 100 million party members. That's a power structure that monopolizes every aspect of Chinese life. So that's really powerful. So I'm talking about this hardcore people who really matter, right? So that's basically it. Now, the revival of Confucianism in China, it's true. It's been happening, but it also is not happening simultaneously. Confucianism is a very good, convenient way. All ruling class people like Confucianism because it really stresses hierarchy, respect for authority, all the things, right? But a religion only makes sense, and the revival of anything makes sense only in an environment where religion is constitutionally protected, the practice of any religion, right? So in China, you don't have that. So your practical religion, Confucianism, is very difficult to take the Confucianist practice to its logical conclusion. For example, if you want to have some kind of ceremony to celebrate Confucius' birthday, you got to go through a lot of permits. The system is designed to stop you from doing that kind of stuff, unless it's completely controlled by the party, right? So secondly, Confucianism also could be very dangerous too. Because in Confucianism, is also say there's an idea of the mandate of heaven, right? Because it deals with legitimacy. Confucianism works because it assumes the regime is legitimate through the mandate of heaven, which is very, very weird stuff. It's like a divine rights to rule, right? It's pre-modern. It's anti-democratic. But the Chinese people were always very, very keen to develop some kind of mass psychology to assume the regime in power may have lost its mandate of heaven, right? So that's why, and people don't have any tangible proof to get that kind of a message. Historical history, the most tangible proof is always through signs of earthquake, fire, floods, right? And that's why the Chinese Communist Party is really scared of this, any mass movement, any religious movement. Once you develop to a certain scale, it will be done. Like a Falun Gong, for example. That's a very good example, right? So, so Confucianism, yes, there is a revival. I think it's a revival mostly for tourists, to be honest with you. There's only one good Confucian scholar that I can think of right now who can say something with a little bit of immunity. It's a Canadian guy, Daniel Bell. He lived on a thin thread. He couldn't even live in Beijing. He was shuffled to Shandong province, right? He's a guy who has a visceral dislike of Western democracy, so he goes to China to find his intellectual pilgrimage over there. But he couldn't even he couldn't even publish his book very freely. But he could, I think, he could never be allowed to become the voice of the advocacy.
Russell?
I'm Russell Berman. Miles, thanks for the talk. I'm still Russell Berman. Miles, thanks for the talk.
Okay.
I mean, you were talking about ideology, so I want to focus on the ideology question, Marxist ideology in China. But I was also struck by your reference to 2016. Another questioner raised that. It made sense to me. Trump and Xi Jinping in 2016 were both in different ways announcing their critique of the international order.
Yeah.
They were both making nationalist moves. Right? So my ideological question is, Marxism, from the beginning, from the Communist Manifesto, was a theory of globalization. The proletariat has no homeland. It was all about an international system. What happens to Marxism in China in particular when globalization breaks down?
I don't think I quite understand your question, but I think I understand. Okay, but I don't know whether the correct one. So I may be a revisionist or Marshall Berman thoughts. It's a great risk for the Chinese Communist Party to allow international capital to go to China. But they really cannot afford not to do it, because the Chinese economy is about 50-50, right? So 50% of Chinese economy is controlled by the government directly. Another 50 is basically in sort of we call, there's no private enterprise per se in China, because everything is owned by the government, means of production, they say. So you are allowed to practice capitalism within the international trading system. But ultimately, the government can allow you to do it and also can disallow you to do it anytime. Alibaba, all other things, the same thing. However, this sort of non-state factor has been the sole source of China's economic growth. Almost 100% of China's economic growth has come from that private sector. And that private sector has become very, very powerful. It's intrinsically related to international capital, right? Like say Alibaba. Alibaba basically is China's version of Amazon. And it's much more powerful than that. So Alibaba has built a consumer database of 550 million people. That's a lot of people. How you bank, how you do. Unlike the United States, in China, everybody, the payment system is all through this. Credit card is ancient, Checks is what? Nobody knows it. So it's a very, very electronic, very advanced. It's all because of Alibaba doing things. So, and then Alibaba wants to have its own payment system. That deals with China's monopoly on currency. That freaks them out. So that's why the party say, hey, this is too dangerous. We cannot allow you to do this. First of all, we cannot have total control of the 500 million database, right? We have to do it. So that's why Xi Jinping took over, right? So that's why I think when we say, decoupling is bad for global trade, it's like we assume that China doesn't want it. If you read Xi Jinping, if you follow him, it's the opposite. He doesn't mind, because he calibrated the risk and the benefit, right? So he's actually facilitating that kind of process, decoupling, because it will be safer. Ultimately, it's the regime survival that's really matters. So, people are surprised, at least the Wall Street Journal is surprised, that somehow when the U.S. government is trying to sort of to strengthen the regulatory control of Chinese companies listed in the United States, we thought China will basically, hey, they're going to protest, they're going to do something. No, China said, okay, let's get out there. The government basically was actively sort of speed up that process. It's all about how much the party can control, how much they cannot. So in the scenario you mentioned, I think, Chinese Communist Party will be totally happy to have total control of the non-state sector of economy and what Habermas said, public space.
Thank you, Miles, for the wonderful talk. I think I just.
Introduce yourself. Please.
Yeah, I'm CJ Yao Sijia from University of Nebraska Lincoln. So it's wonderful to see you and talk, and it's really very intelligent and at the same time very humorous.
No, you make me feel like I'm dead.
I just feel like the talk is really inspiring, and also really like the theme this time for Telos because it's civilization. And I've been noticing actually Telos for years, and I always thinking like, oh, how can I participate? This is really the good chance for me to participate as a humanist, doing research on culture. So when it comes like civilization, it's really kind of like I agree and disagree, just as I was listening to your talk also, agree and disagree when you're talking about China. You are very alert about a lot of parts of the China part, like the side part, the dark part, and about the Marxist side. I think I agree with you about the Marxism when we were taught in China, and also it's kind of different when I come here to take the critical theory courses, and it's so different to interpret Marx theory, different from China. But now I kind of change also, like I transform my interpretation of Marx again, thinking that it's actually kind of same to some extent, because to some extent you're also mentioning like Marx is kind of like that kind of theory is making like flattening, and now I kind of feel like in US that has the trend, like really the multiculturalism, there is no value hierarchy. That is making me think of that in China we are also kind of think everybody is equal, but we are also like working together and labor and serve the country. So just like the civilization, and I just feel like I always have a passion for culture, and this time I really kind of like have another thinking that culture can also be, because I like the 4 classics. Right? When I read the 4 classics in Chinese, I really like the 4 classics. But that's also part of the Chinese civilization.
That's true, yeah.
Yeah, but it actually has nothing to do with culture or civilization itself. It's actually how you use them.
Yeah.
And I just like, it's so sad to see that culture is actually exploited and abused by some politics and some kind of ideologies.
Yeah.
And I also have some things you're talking about, like ideology and civilization kind of have that link. But to be brief, my question is, so you criticize about China, and I'm just wondering if you can have some insight about the other side, US, because US is having this democracy and freedom, and I always think this is a great ideology. But it's also ideology. But any ideology has its weak spot. I know we don't want to talk about Trump, but when we talk about when the pandemic starts, there's like a misinformation about the virus and the mask, and it was like people's lives are not actually thought about, but it's always an economic number.
Yeah.
So I just wonder, like, oh, we don't want to wear a mask, or we don't want to do this, and it's my freedom.
That's right.
So that's the typical American freedom. It could be also harm, have the harm part, negative part. So I just wonder.
Yeah. So I think that's a very good question. Thank you for all those kind of words about my talk. Let me just put it this way. The last time I heard the American intellectual talk about ideology, American ideology, is Richard Hofstadter, right? He's long dead. That was a long time ago. So when Americans use ideology, it always feels a little bit strange to me, because Americans don't talk about that kind of stuff at all. Does not necessarily mean there's no ideology at all, right? There are. But as I say, I started my talk by talking about the fundamental founding creed of America. That is, all men are created equal. So those things were so self-evident. I mean, no pun intended, right? It's there. So people don't talk about it. I will say, we often say, America is the oldest democracy, and democracy is about processes over there. Majority will has to be respected, minority rights has to be protected. Those are all right. But those are sort of, rat race, right? And the party politics are always very dirty, back and forth, back and forth. If you live in Washington, D.C. like I do, it's pretty sickening, as a matter of fact. So I turned my TV to like a fishing show now. So no politics. But there is something that's really, really deep. And I think one of the things, fundamental difference between China and the United States ideology is that China's ideology is always spoken. It has to be propagated. The United States, you don't talk about it. One of the guys that I actually think that really knows about this kind of stuff, the unspoken American ideology, is George Will. So George Will, many years ago, wrote a book, something about the unique American, the peculiar American sort of a sense of ideology. That is, there's an area that beyond the reach of the majority. So beyond the reach of the majority is a phrase taken from Madison. That's a very interesting idea. That is, outside of the cycle of vicious politics, majority, minority, Democrats, Republicans, Federalists, Whig, whatever you fight, Confederacy and the Union. There's something much higher than that. That's universal. That universality is basically the area that beyond the reach of the majority. In other words, it's like a nirvana. It's out of rat race. It's out of the suffering cycle. This actually is the idea that Secretary Pompeo, behind his commissioning of this committee, it's called the Committee on Unalienable Rights. That area beyond the reach of majority is the unalienable rights. If you want to say what's the essence of American ideology, in my view, that's it. It's basically everybody is there, and without doubt, you are majority, minority, that's yours. I don't know how. Of course, we can talk about American ideology. There's mostly from the political science department, history department right now is talking about American imperialism, this racism, all the things. I don't think that's ideology. I always say that's like legacy of history, and we're always working toward the more perfect union. And we had this very founding domain of beyond the reach of majority, and we work from that perfect promise and onward. So that's basically that's my understanding of American ideology. So I don't know. I could be wrong.
So much. Andrew Wender from University of Victoria in British Columbia. Thank you so much for your talk. The colleague just before me, in referencing the pandemic, was getting to one question that I wanted to ask. And if it's okay, I wanted to ask a follow-up to that, in addition with a very brief follow-up to Russell's question. So in two parts, I appreciate very much that your perspective is a philosophical one, your analysis is a philosophical one and not a geopolitical one. But I wanted to ask, from the perspective of how the philosophical argument is applied, what do you see as the ideological motivations for the Chinese government's policy approach to COVID? So zero COVID, for example. And if I could just add the follow-up to Russell's question very briefly, one of the implications I understood, or I personally took from Russell's question, is whether nationalism as such is part of the ideological blend or matrix for Beijing at present. Okay. So if it's okay to put those two questions out there. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. So I'll be trying to be brief. Okay. That's a very good question. The philosophical, the ideological strand behind China's pandemic policy is very clear to me. Rather than treating this pandemic as an issue of public health, as a medical crisis of enormous consequences, the Chinese Communist Party, from beginning, with Xi Jinping's specific instruction, treated this as a very good opportunity to demonstrate the capability of Chinese Communist Party, the rightness of the party. If you don't believe me, watch all his speeches. his first publicly published speech to the whole nation is on February 23rd of 2020. In that speech, he was talking about every Communist Party member should take this opportunity to showcase the glory and the virtue of the Chinese Communist Party. Every party member should be on the front line to fight this thing. So this is very consistent, by the way. It's not Xi Jinping. Every time there's a flood, there's kind of fire, earthquake, natural disasters, the party center get really excited. But this is a great opportunity to showcase. This is not exactly we focus like hydraulic society, Oriental despotism, but it's very close. So in the February speech, Xi Jinping, which is a sort of guideline, if you read it, it's very comprehensive. I translated the whole thing for the entire U.S. government. The next day it came out. So, and people get it. So Xi Jinping said, what, because we have to really treat this as a political task rather than a public health issue, therefore, we must guarantee positive energy is released. In other words, 正能量. In other words, all the information that will depict this as bad, from the doctors, from the scientists, from journalists, has to be squelched. That's exactly what happened. So that's why the ideological underpinning of China's pandemic policy is very clear to me. And you know what? Xi Jinping, in that speech, he said, because when the pandemic broke out, everybody was reporting about this, the Communist Party just remained silent for about like 3 weeks. And New York Times wrote an article saying, hey, where's Xi Jinping? So where's Waldo? No, he's not to be found. And then in late February, the speech I mentioned about, the first public speech, he mentioned something very, very interesting. He said, I took this very seriously. I took personal command of the whole issue from the beginning. As a matter of fact, my first meeting at Politburo took place on January 7th, 2020. That's days, like literally a week after the outbreak, right? Reported. I give instructions. What did he say to that Politburo meeting? Nobody knows. But all we know is the next day, if you follow his speeches, right? Next day, he was somewhere in some kind of a celebrity party school to talk about the advanced nature of the Chinese Communist Party, the timeliness of the Chinese Communist theory. This guy is ideologically obsessed. He talked about those things, so this is the one we call the political animal, in a different context. So that's why I think China's policy is guided by, I use a philosophical, it's kind of a little bit of a nerdy word to say it, but it's ideological, really is. When we criticize them for their cover-up, that is another piece of tangible evidence of international anti-China forces trying to stifle the triumph of socialism under Chinese Communist Party. It's all there in the open. I don't even have to read the tea leaves. So we have to develop the habit of taking their words very seriously. So what's the second question you talk about?
It was just about whether you perceive nationalism distinctly as part of the ideological makeup.
Oh, yes. Nationalism is a tool. It's not the ultimate. The Chinese, Chinese are for Taiwan, right? Taiwan is a matter of national unification. It's a symbolic, ultimate symbol of Chinese nationalism. Listen, the Chinese Communist Party don't care about national territory at all. If you superimpose the map, a Chinese political map, just territorial map of 1949, and today's map, 2022, you superimpose a new map over there, you see how many Chinese territories the Chinese Communist Party has given away. It's about like 20, 30 times bigger than Taiwan. All to the countries China considers friendly. Mongolia, Burma, former Soviet Union, and North Korea even, you name it. So if Chinese Communist Party is really nationalist, that should not really happen, right? So that's one thing. Another thing is nationalism obviously is very important because this is the Chinese Communist Party. Earlier I mentioned about this gigantic schism between the ruling elite and the people. The Chinese people don't really believe in communism at all, but they live in China. They're nationalists, right? For classics, all the things. Of course, it's good. If Chinese team win Olympic gold, if I were a Chinese citizen, I would be very proud of that, right? As a matter of fact, I'm proud of all the people who won won medals, right? So this is something that you champion this thing. So I would consider that Chinese nationalism expressed in a normal way, but that Chinese nationalism has been exploited to the greatest extent by the Chinese Communist Party to use that for geopolitics, particularly in South China Sea and other regions, because China uses nationalism to champion its big power status. I mean, China is a 大国, right? And all those other tiny countries over there in the periphery, the Vietnamese, the Philippines, they're 小国, they're little countries. They openly say so. So there is kind of a little bit of chauvinism over there. In that sense, I think there is kind of a Putin idea and a Xi Jinping idea. They converge, but ultimately, I think it's something deeper than that. If China really is a nationalist country, the party probably should take care of its own people, right? National needs. I mean, look at China. I mean, the oppositional clash is so ready to erupt in China. You watch what's going on in Shanghai. The Chinese Communist Party said, you know what? We found some kind of cases, what 200 cases of asymptomatic test. The whole city of 22 million locked down. Are you kidding me? So that's, I mean, people in Shanghai is just had enough now. I mean, so in other words, I mean, the tension is there. So I think the party always is, Xi Jinping have two great things to say about Chinese system. He said the reason China is doing great from his perspective in terms of COVID is because China has two advantages. One is the superiority of the socialist system. Secondly is the glorious leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. When it does, by that he said, no, he could master enormous human and material resources to do big things. And he has a phrase for the 集中力量办大事. It's true. But once the power is so concentrated, it's so arbitrary, so it's not just to use this power to do big things, it's to do big, stupid things. And that's what eventually would happen. Look at what China's history, I'm a historian, you look at all the things from Great Forward, Cultural Revolution, it's all have this kind of landmark mentality, eglomaniac mentality. That's also very reflective of that. So power has to be checked, has to be diffused. Otherwise, we're all going to be screwed.
Thank you very much.
Sir, I think there is a question in our Zoom chat, so I will read it out loud.
Great, thank you.
It is from Karen Skinner, and they ask, Miles, do you think we got it right in policy planning at the State Department when I started talking about China as a civilizational challenge?
Yeah, I think it's right. I mean, I think when I say civilization, well, when you use the phrase, hi Karen, by the way. Okay. I think a civilizational challenge is right because the word civilization is very, very often used to represent not necessarily in terms of ethnicity and culture, but also in terms of different kind of could be kind of ideological blocks as well. I mean, if you read, if you watch all the old films in all the 40s and particularly 50s, right? When we talk about Nazis or talk about the Soviet rise in the 50s, we talk about this is about Western civilization. This is about civilization, way of life. So I think it is in that sense the challenge posed by the Chinese Communist Party is very similar. However, it is not like the Chinese, ethnic Chinese people challenging the rest of people who are non-Chinese, right? Because as I say, most of people in China who are ethnically Chinese, they don't agree with the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, the overwhelming majority of people in Taiwan who are ethnic Chinese, they don't like that. So I think my understanding that when you say civilizational challenge, from that perspective, I think, yes, it is right.
Other questions? Oh, right here.
Hi, thanks so much. Mark Weiner from New Haven, Connecticut. Alex, we should talk afterwards. Just a question, if you could elaborate a little bit. Was it your claim that civilizational as opposed to ideological or explicitly philosophical thinking has been the basis for past State Department policy formation toward China. Could you give us a greater sense of that, if I understand it correctly? And if that's the case, how would you compare or contrast that with the intellectual tendency that undergirded policy formation toward the Soviet Union?
So our policy toward the Soviet Union was formulated by different strands of intellectual considerations, right? First of all, you got this overall strategy, which is containment. That is proposed by George Kennan, right? So what Kennan says that, hey, listen, Soviet Union will behave very badly in 1940, 45, 46, 47, right? People don't understand why. So people say, hey, listen, Walter Lippmann, for example, say Soviet Union has its own legitimate security concern. Therefore, it must conquer all the countries in order to build this security buffer. So George Kennan said, no, that's all wrong. You guys don't understand the forces that animated Stalin. Why he had to do this. Remember that long telegram, does anybody know this, the title of the Mr. article? It's not about Soviet behavior. It's called the sources, the source of Soviet conduct. Not about ideological understanding of that. That's why we got it right, because we understand. George Kennan first said this is a Soviet expansionism is intrinsically related to Marxist-Leninist ideology. Okay, and there's also some other things, but this is a predominant interpretation, a conclusion of what I say. That's why we have this very strong theoretical understanding of that. Secondly, and we have a national consensus. Because George Kennan won the argument. We have leadership too. Truman, Eisenhower, they all got it right. So there's national commitment. On top of that, we have Congressional Act and the American popular commitment to it. The National Security Act of 1947 completely changed our defense and intelligence establishment to basically deal with the overwhelming central threat of our time, which is the Soviet Union. So they would not be bothered by, say, for example, our inability to shut down the Soviet like a task or Soviet like some kind of company here. We cannot do it right now because China is integrated into the global trading system. We cannot even tell Google or Twitter to shut down any Chinese accounts, government accounts, right? We can't do that because this is different time. So that's why we got it right. Another factor which I think is very important is we have a great pool of right understanding about the nature of the Soviet regime from the immigrants of Eastern European and Soviet origin. They come over here, they brought an incredible amount of knowledge, and those knowledge were incorporated into American foreign policy formulation. You name it, right? Madeleine Albright just passed away, and her dad was a Czech diplomat who defected, who became an eminent Soviet expert, right, out of Colorado, who taught, among others, congressional rights, right? So everybody understand that. You got Brzezinski, all those guys, Kissinger, they have very good sort of old world wiles about the nature of the Soviet regime, and they all have this have the kind of ideological training, I would say, grounding, right? Whatever they do, they understand. They can understand the regime not just from nationalist point of view, but also from ideological, philosophical, and intellectual perspective. That is very important. In our China policy, we used to have some of the stuff, but because of Vietnam War, because of McCarthyism, it was never that much. There's no immigrant voice, first of all, right? And then we had the 1972 framework. Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger with China and struck a deal with China. So 1972 framework, which has been dominant in our China policy circle for more than half a century, which is fundamentally wrong. Because what that did was very geopolitical, right? It's basically, the deal was, the two key elements of the 1972 framework of US foreign policy toward China. One is we're going to engage China, engagement. The engagement in the hope that to induce change, to force China to make a change. If we say bring China into World Trade Organization, so the thinking is that China will behave like a responsible person, right? Entity, a factor, and then we treat them like there's always this, bring China into the community of nations. That's the idea. Now, I mean, forgive me for saying this, but that's a very 19th century missionary sort of thinking, right? China always needs to be led into salvation by somebody from outside. But that really soothes our soul, so we're comfortable with that. Secondly, the 1972 framework is fundamentally non-ideological. The deal was that we're going to seek common interest. U.S.-China will benefit together. It's called a win-win. So the fundamental framework of U.S.-China relationship is just a matter of trade-off, mutual trade-off of interest, right? About those major areas that we're not going to agree on, human rights, communist ideology, intellectual property right, Taiwan, all the other issues, unpleasant issues, we're not going to talk about it. Chinese call it 求同存异, right? Seeking common interest, cast aside differences. So as a result, for nearly 5 decades, we don't talk about the issues that really matter. About our national security, about our conscience, about our morality. China got away with egregious violation of all sorts of things, but then we do have some common interest. China knows that, but this common interest will be used by the Chinese government as leverage, either in the Vietnam War, because we need China to get out of quagmire there, or in our dealings with nuclear threats from North Korea or Iran. China always play cards. So we are very smart about how clever we are putting the China card against the Soviet Union. It has always been the case that China played the US card much, much more successfully. And we have a permanent class of China lobbyists in this country who have influenced our foreign policy formulation toward China just tremendously. And I think Trump administration, I don't want to brag about it, but we definitely minimize those impact. So I think, I'm very proud of being part of that process, and along with Russell and Chiron and several other people in the policy planning. We did, it was a good run. I enjoyed it. I wish the train ride would be longer, maybe 4 years longer. Yeah.
Just as a follow-up, just so I understand. So it's the international political settlement of 1972 that is in some sense the origin of the non-ideological thinking of today in relation to China.
That's right. That's right. So that's basically, that's kind of a peculiar Chinese version of history is over, right? The end of history. So 1972 is ended. So that's why when we say, hey, listen, Berlin Wall came down, therefore no more communism. Wait a second, there was a huge communist party there. I mean, it's pretty communist to me. So for those of us who grew up there, I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? But it's not in America's collective consciousness, particularly in the policy elite circle.
Well, we're at the end of our time. I would like to thank Miles again for a fantastic talk. Great discussion as well. Yeah?